In this week's video, I'll be throwing and trimming a batch of these angular vases. I attempt to steer clear of more traditional vase forms, even though I love to throw curvaceous forms with a narrow foot and a flared out rim, but such pieces really wouldn't fit in with the style that I've made for myself and cultivated over almost 10 years, and so this throwing session really was just some exploration to try and find some new vase shapes which I really like. Shapes that can either be scaled up or down and certainly refined over time. I used roughly about 2 pounds per piece, which is about 900 grams. Each piece is thoroughly wedged up, which is a process that pops any tiny air pockets inside the lump and ensures that it's one even texture throughout. If I didn't do this step quite thoroughly, I could have a much more difficult time when it comes to actually throwing the pot on the wheel. You can sometimes get away with it, but ultimately it depends on the condition the clay you're using comes in, and this high iron stoneware clay body, which you saw me get out of a bag at the start of this video, tends to be a bit harder around the edges, so wedging it properly is important. Once I'm ready to begin, the lump of clay is thrown firmly onto the middle of the wheel. I then douse the clay with water, and the first thing I always do is squash it down slightly before coning it up and down a couple of times. The process of coning the clay up and down is sort of like wedging, but on the wheel, and even after just repeating this process 2 or 3 times, I can feel a huge difference in the lump of clay beneath my hands. It flows more smoothly, and it almost feels more willing to conform to the movements my hands are imparting on it. To avoid a divot forming in the centre of the lump of clay as I cone it up and down, I make sure to throw a rounded top on the lump of clay before I begin pressing it upward. And then, once the centering process is over, I squash it down so it has a flatter top, and then with a wetted thumb and index finger, I push into the middle and then drag those 2 digits outward towards myself. I don't push down any further as I want to ensure the base stays about 6 or 7 millimeters thick. I then use the pad of my thumb to run it back and forth over the surface to compress it. This doesn't mean I'm necessarily pushing down any further, I'm just running the digit back and forth over the base to smooth it and really make sure it's flat. I then grasp the clay at the bottom with a knuckle on the outside and pads of fingers on the inside. They push and almost pinch together and move upward in one even motion, with the walls of the pot and my hands covered in water and slip to ensure they can flow over the surface quite freely without either part sticking to the other. There's a delicate balance, because if you use too much water, the integrity and strength of the clay quickly diminishes and becomes much weaker, and it becomes more and more difficult to pull up the walls and to achieve any height, unless you work exceptionally quickly. On the other hand, if you don't use enough water, the friction caused by the rotation and your hands moving will cause the pot's surface to dry out and become very sticky, and as soon as it does that, it'll stick to your hands and the whole pot will be drawn off center, deformed, or even destroyed if you don't happen to catch it quickly enough. I'd say this is one of the most difficult aspects of learning to throw. It really took me a while to feel comfortable pulling up the walls, and I think much of that simply comes down to gaining an understanding of what the limits are of the particular clay body you're using. And a good way of doing that is to simply throw a dozen or so cylinders as tall and thin as you possibly can, even if they break. I think it takes pushing the clay to its limit and seeing what will cause it to break or buckle or collapse is really important. And even if it's frustrating seeing pots destroyed on the wheel, the insight you'll gain from doing this is well worth it. For this particular pot, I want its shape to begin with a wide base, which then angles inward to a more narrow section around the waist, before flaring out again as it travels upwards towards the rim. So I began just by throwing a rough cylinder that bowed inward. Then, when I was more or less happy with the rough shape, I began to refine it. I try not to do any of the shaping too dramatically and suddenly. Instead I change it bit by bit and section by section. And I really enjoyed making this batch of pots, as I didn't have too much of a preconception of the exact shape I was going to make before sitting down on the wheel. Instead, I just tried to throw each one to be quite different from the last, while still following a few strict parameters, such as remaining angular in form and all being roughly the same height. You can more or less see the finished form now, but before I can take this pot off the wheel, there's a handful of things I need to do. I start by removing any water trapped inside the pot with a sponge strapped onto the end of a stick. If the water is left in the pot overnight, it can disintegrate the base of the vessel, or it'll simply keep the bottom of the pot much wetter for much longer, which means it'll take more time for the pot to turn leather hard so that it can be trimmed. Next, I use a metal kidney to scrape clean the outside surfaces of the pot. This refines the shape, and by removing all the wet slip that's coating the pot, it'll mean it can dry out more quickly, and it also enables me to pluck the pot off the wheel using just my bare hands, like you'll see in a moment. On the lower section of the vase, I could easily just push the metal straight into the clay, as the walls on that section of the pot are slightly enclosed and sturdier than that of the rim. And so, on the upper walls and rim section, instead of jamming the metal straight into the clay, I instead offer the metal up, so it's just skimming along the surface, and then I push inside out against the metal edge. And I think by doing it this way, there's less chance that the metal tool will catch on the sticky clay, which could then lead to the entire pot being destroyed as it's dragged out of shape. I then take a soft chamois leather and drape it over the rim, to soften it and smooth it, and then I drag a twisted metal wire beneath the pot, which separates it from the metal wheelhead. I then scrape clean my hands of slip, gently clasp the pot, and lift it away. A day or so later, the pots are leather hard, and in fact they're actually whitening a bit around the rim to bone dry, which isn't a good thing, but it is quite easy to fix. And so I simply dunked the rims of each of these into some water, and then left them standing upright for 10 minutes or so. For the trimming of these, I brush some slip onto the wheelhead, and then place the vase onto it. It's then tap-centered into the middle, and I also squash down a portion of the wall onto the wheelhead itself. I like trimming pots like this, as it means I can turn all of the walls on the outside without any lumps of clay getting in the way, or mechanical arms like you find on Giffen grips. That isn't to say that those aren't viable and useful methods. They most certainly are. This is just the technique I've settled on for trimming much of my work. It can be quite hard to get the knack for it, and to get the pots to really stick down securely. But once you've figured out how to do that, it's incredibly versatile and very useful for all manner of forms. I found with these really sharp bison tools, I can get away trimming the clay when it is a touch more firm, which I like, as it makes the whole vessel a bit more sturdy, and it means there's less of a chance it'll deform as I move it and handle the pot. If you're new to watching me work, it may help to know that I'm a potter who probably likes to trim more than they like to throw. I like to trim my pots to be exceptionally thin and light, as the glazes I use tend to either go on very thinly or very thickly, if it's my crackle glazes, which are the ones I normally use. Once coated over these thin, angular forms, they can change the appearance of the pot quite dramatically. As the glaze pools in certain regions of the pot, even on the outside surface, it can soften the shape of the pot, whereas on sharp edges, such as the rim, or any other dramatic change in angle, the glaze can break, which is the term we use to describe how the glaze reacts when it breaks over a sharp edge of clay. And with this particular clay body, when the glaze does break, it reveals a rusty warm hue that can be almost metallic and iridescent as the iron-bearing clay beneath begins to shine through, like you can see on the sharp lip of this teapot lid here. So in many ways, when I'm making and finishing pots, I'm thinking about how they're going to look with the glaze on at the very end. And I suppose in some instances, as I know the glaze will soften the forms, it means I'll exaggerate them somewhat, making them more angular than needs be, and perhaps sharper in places too. Once the outside walls have been refined and shaped, I then go over the surfaces with a flat metal edge, and with this tool I scrape over and remove any of the harsher marks left by the trimming tools. I don't burnish them to be completely smooth though, and equally I don't mind if there are a few soft spirals left in the surface. The glazes I use are quite good at hiding these smaller marks, so there's no need to worry about removing them until the surface is completely clean and spotless. Once the outside walls are done, I can flip the pot over to begin working on the base. And in that moment of removing the pot and flipping it over, it's a good opportunity to check the weight of the vessel. And in this case I felt that the lower section of the wall, now at the top, needed just a touch more removed from the outside. So I secure the pot in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, and then as I trim you can see that I connect my 2 hands together. In this case my thumbs are sort of interlocking as I work. The elbow of my right arm is tucked into my torso to add stability, and my left hand is applying downward pressure from on top in the hope of keeping the pot pressed firmly down against the wheel. Essentially, throughout this process I try to add as much stability as I possibly can, so that the tool remains as steady as possible when it's trimming over the surface of the pot. I don't want the tool to be influenced by any tiny undulation in the walls of the vessel, and instead it just slices through them, leaving a perfectly even, trimmed surface behind it. The bases of all my pots are more or less the same, unless of course it's a bowl I'm trimming, which will have a taller, more elegantly trimmed foot. With any other pot, such as a mug or a vase or my teapots, this is how I finish their base. I turn a beveled edge around the outside. This creates a point of contact that's less likely to chip when placed on tables or in the cupboard or just moved around. It also creates an undercut, which means when the pot is placed down, it casts a shadow beneath itself, like you can see on this small jar, and it creates the subtle illusion that either the pot is hovering ever so slightly, and it also disconnects the object from whatever surface it's placed onto. And what I mean by that is if I just finished the base of this pot with a sharp right angle, it would almost look as if it flows into the surface it's placed onto, rather than being its own individual object. So I bevel the base, so this shadow is cast. Otherwise my aim is to trim the base so it's as neat and tidy as any other part of the pot. I don't want someone to pick up the vessel, turn it over to see the base, and think, oh, they must have forgotten to finish the base of this pot. So I trim it carefully, and then burnish the bottom with this metal kidney. This compresses any coarse bits of sand back into the clay body and makes the surface nice and smooth. And now that all the clay work is more or less finished, I can stamp the pot with my maker's mark, which is when I carved myself from a block of porcelain using the tip of a needle, and once pressed into the clay and reduction fired, it should look something like this. And with that one vase complete, I can move on to the rest. They're fun things to trim, as each one is different, and provides its own challenges. I don't really think of the function of these objects while producing them. It's their shape and their proportionality that I really focus on. They don't have a handle or a lid, nor do they need to stack together. They'll either be filled with flowers, or simply placed on a shelf or a mantle as a standalone decorative object. I think in the past that might have really annoyed me, as at the start my focus was almost entirely on functional ceramics. At least, that's when my passion started. Nowadays I'm very content making objects to simply look at. Pots that are perhaps a bit more sculptural, to fill a certain nook or cranny in your home or at your studio. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. On pots that do have a slight undulation in the walls, like this one does, I find that using a tool with a smaller blade to very slowly work my way up and down is the easiest way to be rid of it. I can apply more focused pressure with this smaller blade, whereas with the larger one it's more difficult to accurately apply the same pressure whilst keeping the tool perfectly steady, and this particular bicing turning tool has been perfect for this task. I'll never be able to get rid of the wobble entirely. It is, of course, exaggerated by the fact that it's quickly spinning around, but as soon as it's still and stationary, you quite literally won't be able to see it. And I'm not saying that as an excuse for poor craftsmanship. I simply don't believe that a small undulation is poor craftsmanship, especially if the rest of the vessel is finished to a very high degree. Ultimately, I am a person, and these are handmade pots, thrown by one person on a wheel, not in a factory. I think often people presume that I'm making thousands and thousands of pots per year, or that I have a team in the studio helping me do everything. I don't. Everything you see on my YouTube and on my Instagram and on my website, be it the pots, the videos, the photographs, everything is all done by me. I am probably at the point where I need a personal assistant, but I'm not very good at relinquishing control, and I like the fact that my social medias sort of do reflect me as a person as opposed to more of a brand. And I like to think that the people who support me either by watching or liking my videos or purchasing my pots understand that. Sometimes, when I feel like the base of a pot is quite thin, I'll place this nylon spinner on top of it and I'll push down through that. It distributes the weight and the downward pressure, as opposed to focusing it all in one spot, which can happen when you're using your fingers. A fantastically talented engineer and potter makes them, called Richard Carter. I'll leave a link down to his Instagram below, as God knows I receive so many messages and emails about it, but I believe you'll have to get in touch personally with him to inquire, but it's well worth it, and I find myself almost using it on every single pot I trim these days. And yes, I know what you're all thinking about the shape of this pot, but it only resembles what you think it does when it's turned upside down, so once flipped back to the correct orientation and glazed, you'll never notice. I don't think the fleshy colour of this clay does much to help, either. Anyway, I won't show you how I trim all of these. They're going to be interesting pots to glaze, and I suspect it'll be quite hard to get an even layer coated over them, but we'll see, and I guess I'll save that for a video in the future. It's when the pots are shown en masse that I think they really work, in long lines and groups like this. And this is just the first iteration. I'm sure it'll take me a good few attempts to get them to a point where I'm really happy with them. I just hope my glazes don't soften the form of these too much. I have, also, been making a few larger versions, like you may have seen in a short I posted on YouTube a number of days ago. There will also be a full-length narrated video showing how they're made, so that's one thing to look forward to in the future. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.